If you grew up in the 1980s, then I'm sure you're familiar with all the styles that were popular. But perhaps you've forgotten a few, or maybe you're wanting that perfect 80s costume for a party. If so, this is the perfect video for you. Today we will discuss some of the 1980s forgotten fashion. Acid wash jeans became a huge clothing style in the 1980s, but it has its roots in the 1960s surfer culture. It was made with chlorine and a pumice stone, which gave it the unique look. Kind of a more worn appearance than what you would have seen on new jeans. This style became so popular in the 1980s that it was actually causing a pumice stone shortage. Companies started pillaging different places for more stones. If you were one of the cool kids in the decade, then you definitely had some of this denim. Heck, even parents had this. Parachute pants became a super popular fad in the US culture during the 1980s thanks to the increased popularity of breakdancing. These rad pants were made of nylon material, just like actual parachutes. If you had a pair of these, then it helped you on some of the latest b-boy and b-girl moves. They were lightweight, flexible, and slicker than denim. For the most part, it was teenagers that wore them, and boys wore them more than girls. Shoulder pads have come in and out of style since the 1930s. Just about every time you think they'll go away, they come back. And the 1980s was one of those time periods. Designers were really trying to mimic the styles from the 1940s, but they really saturated the market with exaggerated shoulder pads. It is certainly difficult to picture the 1980s and not talk about shoulder pads. Jelly shoes became a fashion trend in the 1980s. They came in an assortment of colors, and girls everywhere had at least one pair. In fact, stores couldn't hardly keep them in stock. The only downside to the shoes is how certain ones could wear into your feet and cause a sore from the rubbing. This was somewhat common in the Achilles heel area. These shoes have continued to be popular throughout the 1990s, and every once in a while they try to come back. Leg warmers are another style that became internationally popular during the 80s. They were originally used by dancers in order to keep muscles warm and to prevent cramping and other injuries. Somewhere along the way, people began wearing them in jazzercise classes and everyday fashion. Every year at Halloween, you'll see someone in an 80s costume, and it never fails that they decide to don these leg warmers for extra flair. Guess jeans are still around today, but they are nowhere as big as they once were in the 80s. If you didn't have a pair, then you probably wanted a pair. These jeans were not cheap, and a lot of people just never had them. But if you were one of the cool kids, then you probably donned a pair of these to hang out at the mall. Jelly bracelets were another huge fad item of the 1980s. They came in a huge assortment of colors, and both girls and young women were wearing them. Oftentimes, they may have worn several of them stacked on their wrist. Some girls even connected two of them for a different look. They remained popular well into the 1990s, and you may still see them today. However, they are not as popular as they once were in the 80s. Scrunchies was a hair tie that had ruffled fabric that was sewn around it. They were supposed to be a better way of holding hair in a bun or a ponytail. When they came out in 1986, they became really popular. Since that time, they have fallen in and out of fashion several times. Jordache is an American clothing company that has all sorts of apparel. But for most people who are around in the 80s, they remember fancy jeans with designs on the back pockets. They became popular in the late 1970s and carried over with even more popularity during the early 1980s. You may even remember the ads in magazines and television with some of the famous models of the time. Since Jordache is still around, you never know when this fad will try to make a comeback. Jams was a style of shorts that became super popular in the mid-80s. They were worn by both girls and dudes. They originated out of the surf culture in Hawaii during the 1960s, but it was the 1980s when they really peaked. These shorts were super colorful and fashionable, and many people had several pairs. There were also a lot of imitations on the market. Ever wonder where the name jams came from? It was a shortened version of the word pajamas. If you were going to wear leg warmers in the 80s, then you were also going to need leotards or a bodysuit. This was also the official uniform for jazzercise, which became extremely popular in the 80s. The more colorful your leotard was, the more cool you were. It was certainly something that lots of moms were wearing. Stirrup pants were a type of close-fitting women's pants that were tapered at the ankle and then had material extending over with a band or strap that went under the arch of the foot in order to keep it in place. It was originally intended to be sportswear for women who were horse riding or snow skiing. However, they became a popular streetwear fashion during the 1980s and stayed around until the mid-1990s. Since that time, they have tried to make several comebacks, but they just can't seem to compete with yoga pants or leggings. T-shirt rings became a super popular fashion item among young women and girls during the 1980s. They were used to sort of cinch or tie up the shirt for a closer fit or style. They came in all sorts of colors and designs, but they were typically round. This is an item that you can still purchase today, but it is nowhere near as popular as it was in the 80s. In addition to clothing fashion, there were also some pretty crazy hairdos that were in style. And in order to make it look good, you were going to need a lot of hairspray. Perhaps no other decade has ever consumed as much hairspray. One of the more popular styles for men was the mullet. You know, business in the front and party in the back. This hairstyle had all sorts of links to it, and there really wasn't any set standard. It's kind of interesting that this hairstyle has made a tiny comeback. It's like reliving the 80s. For women, it was all about having big hair. Bangs were grown out and then almost fixed straight up. Sometimes it was in sort of a tidal wave fashion, but the higher the better. The hair on the side was formed into some sort of wings and really stuck out on the sides. No one, and I mean no one, used as much hairspray as a teenage girl. I'm sure that hairspray sales took a hard dip in the 1990s, and they've probably been hoping for a comeback on this hairstyle. Another hairstyle that was big in the 1980s was crimped hair, which gave it sort of a texture with volume. When you see people dress up in 80s costumes, this is usually the 80s hairstyle of choice. From time to time, you may still see women crimping hair, but for the most part, this is a style that was left in the 80s. The 80s was a decade of vibrant colors and styles. Basically, the bigger and flashier it was, then the cooler you were. There are plenty of other fashions that we did not discuss, so there is more than enough room to do a future episode. What were some of the styles that you loved about the 80s? Let us know in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching.